Nobody wakes up and goes to work and says, I'm going to be a shitty manager today. When you get stuck out on HR Island, how that doesn't actually advance the business, doesn't advance your team, it doesn't advance the cause. What you do speaks so loudly, I cannot hear what you say. I
Yeah.
think that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's really true. Expanding my own range of being able to actually sit in a coaching conversation and not be directive and instead truly inhabit the role of coach. This was incredibly interesting and valuable for me
Mhm.
to expand my range of human interaction in that way was so interesting and eye-opening.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
Welcome to the Making of a Coach, where we unpack how coaches and facilitators turned their passion into a profession. I'm Toby from Metafox, and on this episode, I meet Marie Szuts. Marie's based in Silicon Valley and has helped to grow the web design tool Figma as an HR leader. Coming from the startup culture and the glamorous tech world also showed in Marie's business building story. On the one hand, she's operating on an, as I found, impressive business level. On the other hand, she grew into her coaching iteratively in a series of experiments. Before she built her network, actually by worrying about the business of the startup she was working with. So let's start hearing from Marie herself how being an HR leader in Silicon Valley looks like.
The startup world is extremely energetic. So when you're thinking about the collective energy of a group of really smart people working on hard problems, that's the sort of the very best of Silicon Valley. And there's many times when you're in those environments that it's like what is before you seems like an impossible task. And so the really interesting thing comes from how do you now start chipping away at impossible and not just throw up your hands and say it can't be done because we already tried it. So you just leave those phrases at the side of the road and instead forge forward, trying to figure out how can we do it in a different way. Again, that's Silicon Valley at its best.
Hmm.
The shadow side can be also quite real. So that's where I spend a lot of time working with leaders and how do you mitigate the shadow side?
Yeah, can you take us into a concrete example when you were working at one of these startups? How did your everyday life look like?
Yeah. So when you're a people leader, you need to make sure that you're thinking as a business person and not just working through a laundry list of people projects. So if I'm thinking about kind of day to day coming in, what is it that we're trying to do as a business? And what are the activities today, this week, this quarter, and in the next 6 or 9 months that me as an individual, because almost always a manager in a Silicon Valley startup is a player coach. So, for me, thinking about like coming in when in the early days of Figma, what do we need to build from a people infrastructure ground up? How do I need to make sure that I understand the sales motion of what we're doing? But then it was a lot of meeting with other senior leaders and meeting with ICs. I started at Figma, I was number 48 or so. Meeting with everybody and being in contact with the entire company was possible then and super informative because we're collectively building something like that. I don't want to create an HR policy just because and impose it on people who don't know me and don't know that I'm attached to the business. I spent a lot of time in those early days being very present with the entire team, not just fellow executives, but all the way down to IC engineers. Being part of the early DNA of a startup is incredibly satisfying. I like to think about culture as a co-created project. It's not imposed from the top down. The top has a lot of effect and leverage, but culture is a co-created project, and you do that by being in contact with the entire team.
It also sounds like you thought a lot about not only HR and how do I do payroll, but you really identified with the business and you were thinking more as a business person than a pure HR person.
Oh, oh, I think that is a necessary quality of a strategic HR leader. You really need to try and to understand when you get stuck out on HR Island, how that doesn't actually advance the business, doesn't advance your team, it doesn't advance the cause. So this is something I've learned. Today, I work with many HR leaders who are maybe in their first head of HR job or maybe second.
Let's go back in this period when you were an HR leader at companies like Figma, thinking to start a coaching business. Which picture would describe what was going on in your mind at this time?
Well, what's interesting is that despite being around entrepreneurial environments for my entire career, I had not cultivated a sense that I wanted to do the entrepreneurial path myself, with me as the solo person in charge. And in fact, I would say I would actually somewhat allergic to the concept of going and being on my own. I deeply identify as a team person, as somebody who loves building teams and working with other people. My overwhelming thought of if I were ever to do something on my own is, wow, I'd be alone. It's so lonely. Interestingly, as I was getting my executive coaching certification, I was doing so with the idea that no matter what I do, those would be useful and interesting skills. So I did not enter into this idea of becoming trained as a coach because my goal is this. This image stuck out to me because that idea of being on the precipice and seeing there's a path, but it goes off into the distance alone. And instead, my journey to doing coaching as a profession was more about a series of small experiments. There's probably another card that represents my journey of becoming a coach. When you ask the question, this is the one that stuck out. It was definitely ambivalent for me for both the lonely reasons and the question of how do you actually make it a business? I have a family to support, this idea of loneliness, even if there was a track to follow. So I see, again, a sense of the trail, the path, something to follow. It's not just one big open expanse where you can choose anything and like kind of the paralysis of choice. There is a tried and true path. And it goes off into a cloudy future. I don't think of this image as scary. There's some lushness to it. You're not in a barren landscape. Instead, there's fertile ground and uniform greenness around. That future is very foggy. I'm not particularly afraid of foggy futures. In startups, you don't have a ton of visibility out very far. So you get used to that. This doesn't scare me, but the image itself feels ambivalent.
Mhm,
Is it a sunny, bright future? I don't know. There's sun behind those clouds. Or are we going into a storm? I don't know.
mhm. Cool. When did you have your first coaching session?
I think that coaching had already been a bit of a thread, but I realized how little I knew about coaching when I started my executive coaching certification program.
Mhm,
I was trained through the Hudson Institute out of Santa Barbara. It's an intensive, high commitment program where you embed in the craft of coaching and develop strong relationships with your cohort members and the faculty. It was an 8 or almost 9 months process of intensives and interstitial work. As part of the certification, you need a roster of coaching clients so that you are doing the work and getting better and being evaluated. You have to record certain coaching sessions and actually get evaluated by a master coach and all these kinds of things. And you're constantly doing coaching with your fellow members, getting practice, getting over the awkwardness. You just gotta do it.
yeah. When you joined that coaching school in Santa Barbara, were you doing that to actually become a coach, being already on the path into this track, and I want to now become a self-employed solopreneur coach? Or was that also
No,
simply to improve your practice as an HR leader?
that was very much the latter. I thought to myself, "I'm very curious about this, and I feel like I know enough to be dangerous, but not really. I feel like I'm probably applying the label of coaching to stuff that I'm doing that's not quite coaching, and so I'm interested whatever next people leader job I take, this will be interesting and valuable because it's stretching me." I found the training transformative to my own self-conception of what coaching is, and I have often been in positions of leadership. For my very first job, I was vaulted into a managerial position, and I'm also the oldest of 3 kids, And so have a bit of that DNA of I know the answer. I I'm gonna get stuff done. And I like that about myself. It's gotten me very far. There's lots of success. And expanding my own range of being able to actually sit in a coaching conversation and not be directive and instead truly inhabit the role of coach. This was incredibly interesting and valuable for me
Hmm.
to expand my range of human interaction in that way was so interesting and eye-opening. And again, I did not set out to say, like, I want to leave this behind. I genuinely thought I'll still be in house, but I will now just be using these skills in a different way.
And these skills, how would you describe that concretely?
I actually feel like I was pretty good at being really in the solutioning and
Hmm.
having some direction there. The coaching skill is to lead from behind, not from the front, to let the client be if they get stuck. How do you help unstick them without your internal narrative screaming, quieting the internal narrative of, I know the answer. And being like this sort of concept of again, unconditional positive regard. That doesn't mean I'm going to say yes to you or let you get away with your own victim narrative. But it's a really different psychological stance than the outcome driven, we've got to get it done. And it's very spacious. It's again, sitting with and being able to ask questions and really empty out expectations of the answers and follow what is happening here with this exquisite presence. And also this concept that we talk about in Hudson of heat, like bringing the heat for a client who may really be stuck in something and doing so in a way that may feel challenging to them, but still keeping a confident and compassionate stance. Because it's not feedback. I actually feel like I developed a fairly that's different from feedback. And there's some emotional stuff in it. Those are some of the key skills. You can learn about them theoretically, and then you got to practice them. And then you can learn some more theory. It's adult layered learning where it's deeper and deeper. Coaching feels like a lifelong profession. One of the most important tenets in terms of making it as a coach is you really have to be a continuous learner. Figure out how you're going to invest in your own growth and self knowledge.
Hmm. So what I hear is letting go of your own smartness when it comes to finding solutions, stepping back, going into the back of the room, bringing that compassion. And what does this coaching school mean when you say bringing the heat for the client?
What it means is because I think what can be misunderstood about this idea of a coaching relationship is I'm holding you in unconditional positive regard. Meaning, again, I'm not coming in with an ulterior motive. I'm not your boss. That's why a coaching relationship can be very useful. It's an external thing. But unconditional positive regard doesn't mean that everything you say or do, I'm like, yes, great. Yes. That's just a yes man bobblehead. Instead, how am I using my coaching discernment to find these moments where you may not see a thing yet or a contradiction or a place where you have gotten to a it's everybody else's fault. And so it, it's the courage and the candor to be able to say, can I stop you there for a second? What I'm noticing is this, or actually what I'm feeling here is this. This is the effect you're having on me. And again, I'm saying that not because I'm judging it or I'm mad at you, but I'm really now giving you some different kind of data. And it may be data that's challenged. It's a little hot for
Hmm.
you. Because I think coaching relationships sometimes can be misunderstood as quasi therapy or a place where I just go to dump my bucket and I like vent the entire time. And but that's the junk food of human interaction. If I don't give you some way to push back, you'll never find the places where you're contributing to the problem. It can feel a little hot in the moment. That's what we mean by heat. It takes some courage, a lot of self knowledge about what's happening here. Or I'm noticing I'm triggered about this and how am I dealing with that, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I see. Super nice. And how did the idea of offering coaching to people outside your organization grow?
It was a slow simmer. I was in a position where having left in-house jobs and done hypergrowth and a lot of work, I need a bit of a rest. I will not say that I was good at knowing what rest really looked like, but I knew on a cellular level I needed that. I joke that it took me probably 6 weeks to stop preparing my coffee, doing the French press like I was late for a meeting. I was so used to moving quickly, running things and multitasking. This was in the summer of 2022. I was thinking I need to slow things down. I had just finished my coaching training and was keen to practice and not let those skills go. I said to myself, do a couple small experiments. I'm sure I'll go back in house later this fall. But for now, this seems fun.
Hmm.
I remember framing it as a series of small experiments. With one of my big objections to becoming on my own would be loneliness. I think you can be a coach and talk to people all day and still be incredibly isolated. And it is on you to figure out how that will not happen. You will be a much better coach if you have community. And that can come in lots of different ways. Because of my coaching training program, there was this subgroup of us, and we're still very close today. They're an incredibly important resource for me, both practically and provide, hey, does anybody know how to do this type of thing? But also just from a sort of deepening of the craft. So go into coaching supervision, like keep up with people you were trained with, make friends with those people. I know that you at MetaFox are creating a community of coaches. This is so important so that you can unpack some of the things that are harder that happen. Because if you don't have those opportunities, the likelihood of you deciding this is super hard and not financially feasible right at the beginning and ending prematurely because it feels too isolating, too alone, too overwhelming.
Who was your first community back then? When you say this is so important, how did this look for you?
This was definitely my Hudson coaching certification community. It was a varied group of people because I did my coaching certification during the pandemic. Even though Hudson never done things virtually before, they did run these cohorts, and it was actually quite incredible and allowed us to have people internationally who wouldn't have otherwise necessarily participated in the program. That core group, I would say, it's one I'm still close with today and have done projects and collaborations with different members. Now you're also tapped into other people's networks.
Hmm.
This is a key part of business development as a coach is being networked, not shallowly, but deeply,
Hmm.
right? When you start your coaching business, you've actually started your coaching business years before. Those people who you've worked with, who you've connected with, who you've done good work for and with, that are going to be, at least for the start, but quite possibly an ongoing source of connections, clients, and, cool stuff to do. And one of the most important things I did at first was that I did find an anchor client, meaning a place, and this is the case, it was a former employer, so I had a lot of credibility there, to go in and say, okay, I'm going to coach X number of your leaders. It's going to be a contract for 6 months, and you're going to pay me this much a month. That anchoring idea is very psychologically helpful. One by one coaching is a very lumpy business. It's a pretty stressful financial model,
Hmm.
especially at first when you're maybe doing some experiments.
So you managed to actually sell a big retainer to a previous employer, and that gave you
Yes.
the security to say, okay, this is more than just an experiment. This is something I can live from. How did you land that first business client?
Remember, I was still in experimental phase. So it's so funny because I feel like I could be quite bold and risky because I was not attached to a certain outcome. I was like, well, let's see what happens. This was a company where I had been there for a long time, done great work, and I was still in touch with the leaders. Quite genuinely, I felt that there was utility in being able to say, okay, I'm a coach and I understand how this company works, but I'm not part of it. I have some context here, but I'm not part of the machine. And it was very important and very clear that when I negotiated with the client, I was working with each individual person as the client. That was the relationship I had. Any information that was to be shared would come from the client to the customer, not from me. This was not like I get to report back about weird stuff. It was effectively like 10 individual relationships. Could I report on aggregate trends? Sure. But it was not, we did 360s as part of the coaching engagement. Those results were not sent to the company
Mhm.
unless the client chose to share it with their boss. Establishing clear boundaries felt very important to me so that I could be doing genuine coaching, not company spying.
Yeah. So the company is paying you, but you are actually serving clients company.
Exactly.
And who were your first clients?
Um, Roles like creative director, VPs of people, The through line for all the different clients I've had is that they're leaders in transition in some way. Maybe they've just been promoted. Maybe they were interim and decided to take the role. Maybe they want to be the 2.0 version of themselves as leader.
How did they find you in these early days?
It's all word of mouth. It's all referrals. So it was referrals through coaching community. They maybe had people in their network who they knew too well. They were too close to, so they couldn't coach themselves. It came through my previous business contacts. Venture capital networks here in Silicon Valley are also a really important source of clients. So knowing the VC talent partners or the people there who have access to a lot of different portfolio companies, just making sure that you're on their radar.
So the VCs, they would be the bosses of your clients, of those venture capital backed.
Not what the client wouldn't call it that, but yes, they're connected. It's an interesting role. The VC, they're often looked to or asked, "Hey, do you know anybody?" Because their job is to be networked.
Yeah.
Their job is to know who's out there and what they're doing. So they get asked.
And how did you get on their radar as a coach?
Working in VC-backed tech startups as an executive, you're on their radar because you're working with them. And you meet them and make friends with them. And I think that now doing the work that I do in terms of teaching strategic HR and being exposed to teaching a lot of these leaders, I get to meet a lot of people and still staying connected to the HR world through conferences, other types of workshops or encounters, retreats, this kind of thing.
Hmm.
And then as you start to do work with clients as well, they can become a source of referrals. But none of it came through cold marketing or I posted a thing on LinkedIn. None of it. It was all through people.
I found this part of our conversation to be an important learning point and also a parallel that I see, for example, to our episode 2 with Helene Feuilar. Marie says her coaching business started a long time before she actually started coaching, because at that time she was making all of these connections in Silicon Valley that she's leveraging today. And a few of you have asked me, Toby, can you actually ask more about social media? And it's not that I'm actually deliberately avoiding that topic, but at least in these examples of Helene and Marie, it's the power of referrals from the network and from previous clients that have helped them to actually find new clients. Marie also mentioned how important it is for her to connect with other coaches, to stay sane and to learn from others' experience, have the sense of community. And she also mentions the coach community that we are building at MetaFox and that you can find on metafox.eu/community. Occasionally, we share some insights there, but most importantly, it's a peer-to-peer network. So you can bring up your own topic as a coach or facilitator, or also simply follow along on the topics that other people bring up. This can be getting input on a facilitation method, recommendations for events, or even feedback on your website. And with that, let's get back to Marie and her business development.
In order to make sure that I'm thinking about new business development in a way that feels sustainable for me, I break up my buckets in like my one-on-one, my one-on-group, and then this other bucket what I call one-on-many. And I don't really know all the time exactly how that's going to show up, but I leave space in my schedule to do projects that will have a flywheel effect on my practice. For example, a marketing plan for me that wouldn't work is writing 20 LinkedIn articles and advertising that way. I would hate doing it. I've become clear that you've got to do something sustainable for you. Last year, I spent a fair amount of time preparing to co-direct and then directing a conference, a business conference, about 280 people, called the Responsive Conference, meant to be about future of work and interesting connections. And because that project to me, it's indirect business development, but it's much more interesting and sustainable to me. The connections from that lead to interesting conversations and collaborations that feed back into potential clients. From a revenue standpoint, one-on-one clients are definitely, it's a higher price point per. So those are the biggest. Then group coaching is probably low down there because I decided not to make it a juggernaut part of my business. And then there's these other projects that are going to have different financial implications.
Yeah. So one-on-one would be direct coaching. One on group would be group coaching. Let's get to that in a minute.
Correct.
And
Yep.
one on many, that is more conference facilitation, moderation. And that gives you the exposure where then afterwards people approach you and said, this was interesting. What do you do? Can we work together? Yeah.
Exactly. In the new business development category, I think about 5 areas of making it as a coach for me. I'm happy to go through those now as I was preparing for this. And I'm a person that thinks in buckets.
Mhm.
That helps me. But bucket number 1 is financial. And what I think is important around this, like, you got to get clear on your own stuff around money. If money makes you uncomfortable, or if you've always had a paycheck that sort of arrived to you through payroll and you didn't have to think about it except once a year when you wanted to negotiate your raise, that's going to come through and that's going to show. To be a business person, you have to have a much more nuanced relationship with what money is. And there's lots of good and interesting books if you feel like you have hangups. There's a great new book called The Power of Enough that really talks about the idea of satiation and like what is wealth. Work with a financial planner to know what you need to make, establish an anchor client. There's a whole bunch of stuff about rates that we can talk to. But let's say like first bucket is financial.
Mhm.
Second bucket is business fundamentals. If you don't identify as a numbers person, I'm just a people person. I like it. Stop that. You got to get over that. Numbers are a learnable skill. And if you're going to be a solopreneur, you've got to actually get at least conversant in them. And again, there's totally ways to do this. If you identify as being really bad with Excel and you don't know how to read a P&L, there are places to learn that. And again, this sort of idea of thinking like a business person, to me, it's like establishing good business hygiene from the start, even if you're doing just experiments. And so, specifics on that. What do I mean by business hygiene? Track your hours. Because if you want to be ICF certified, make a spreadsheet and do it as you go. Get in the habit of once a week, you do like your sort of business admin. Decide what are the pieces of collateral that you actually must have. Right? Good coaching programs will also have a module on here's your contract templates and this kind of, but don't overdo it. But what are the pieces that you need to have? How are you going to invoice people? Again, figure out your tech stack. Do the minimum viable that you need, but consider an accountant, a bookkeeper. What are the time saving things that from the get go you're going to like Calendly? It saves you a lot of time going back and forth with calendars. Do you need 7 other tech tools at the beginning? No, you don't. Start with that and then create a decent website. This is a little bit in the new business thing too. We live in an age where the website does establish credibility. You don't need to, there's so many amazing templates out there. You don't need to do a lot of design. Have a decent website, clean up your LinkedIn or your social media, have a presence that makes you look. So it's business fundamentals. Community, don't allow yourself to become isolated. Do coaching supervision groups, tap into those other communities, participate with gusto, be active. New business development is the 4th bucket. Pursue generosity and networking. Give freely, help others, connect with other coaches, even if you identify as an introvert and think you don't have time for this. It's got to become a sustainable habit. Experience has been that generosity always serves. Diversify your projects and client fishing pool. Don't just have one client because if they go away, you're starting from scratch. Not all your eggs in one basket. That's like how a business person thinks. We talked about this. Your business begins long before you actually start your practice. Thoughtfully add things to your toolkit that you think will open doors for you. For example, if you want to work with a corporate client, they often want you to have 360s as part of it. Decide how you're going to do 360s, but don't get every other certification or tool. It's really expensive, time consuming, and distracts you from actually using them. Pair up with other coaches. Find somebody who's certified in Enneagram and somebody who's, if you need that, now you know who you can call. And then if it turns out like all your clients need that particular thing, yes, go get certified yourself. But you can see this theme of take bite-sized chunks and do so consciously. Okay, so that's 4 of our buckets, right? We talked about the financial bucket, we talked about business fundamentals, we talked about community, we talked about new business development. And then last one is your own growth. Be relentless in the pursuit of self-knowledge and improvement. This is sustainable for you from a brain and growth perspective over time.
Mm.
I just said a lot of words.
Yeah, but it makes a lot of sense. And I like the structure. Finance, being the business person, getting your tools straight and not overdo it. Get your presence straight. Have your social circle to stay sane, to stay happy. And then this idea of sort of radical collaboration, have partners, be generous, operate from this mindset of abundance. I
Totally.
like that, yeah. Is there a story to one of them that maybe you didn't have on the radar initially, and then there was a lesson in which you learned it for yourself?
Maybe, okay, a couple of them. The first one that comes to mind is on the fundamentals side of things, like bookkeeping, where I was convinced, I'm like, oh my God, this is so simple. I have QuickBooks. I can totally do it myself. I spoke to a woman who, interestingly, like, she and I have been friends since we were 3 years old. We ended up kind of following interesting paths, but she went much more the finance. She's a CFO now. And I was having a conversation with her and saying, can I just pick your brain for a second? And she said, Marie, like, there's a reason this is actually a profession. Yes, there's aspects that are simple. And also, is this the place you should be spending time? Go interact with an expert for whom it will be incredibly easy and probably take an hour of their time. And then you can move forward. If you're stuck in a doom loop about your website, knock it off. You still need one. And you can totally do it cheaply, but do you need to do it? So it's finding these different ways where you get out of your own way. And particularly with these details, they can assume outsized importance. And it's not that they aren't important, but you've now overplayed them and short circuit that.
Thank you. Just to wrap up the whole client acquisition discussion, I would still like to talk money for a second.
Yep.
How much is it that you charge now?
Yeah. So we'll start with the philosophy of this and then we'll talk specifics. I have come to the conclusion that I want to charge people for engagements as a chunk, as opposed to hourly rates and invoicing monthly. That means a lot to me because it creates a sense of partnership. You and I are on the same team and you're not hemmed in by the idea that you're thinking, should I call Marie? No, it's going to be on the clock. If it becomes a barrier for us interacting, that is in the way for me. I have a kind of all access plan. We have our
Mhm.
scheduled meetings, but then I'm available separately to do coaching as needed. I see coaching rates that range super wildly. If I know that somebody is being supported by their company, I'm not going to gouge them, but I am going to charge them at the top of my rate scale, between $20,000 and $30,000 for a 6 month engagement.
Mhm.
I deliberately leave space in my portfolio to take on people who, are either fully pro bono or at some reduced nonprofit rate. And again, that's the sliding scale. So the criteria for me then becomes if somebody is funding it entirely themselves. If money is the only thing between us working together, I'd like to figure out how we can creatively make it work without losing my boundaries or becoming resentful. I think it's important that people feel a financial investment in coaching and a real impetus that this is an investment they're making in themselves. So I don't think it's inappropriate to charge real money to do this work.
Yeah, but it's impressive actually to see those differences geographically. Talk to really good coaches all over the world. It's impressive to see the difference. I'm not surprised that Silicon Valley is on the top end, because if I'm trying now to break those numbers down, you're saying 20K for a half year engagement. Let's say you talk with this person on a weekly basis. That ends up being $800 per week, per hour. How is the rhythm?
It totally depends. Maybe we're meeting every other week, but it's for a longer
Yeah.
chunk
Yeah.
because every week can be very intense depending on what they're working on.
Yeah.
There's also a very important aspect of not discounting the amount of prep work
Mhm.
that you do for this. And so it's like the hours you spend on this client are more than just when we're talking face
Yeah.
to face. Doing the thinking work of supporting whoever it is, giving of yourself quite a bit in these engagements. I don't think that it's about being at the beck and call. The CEO calls you, you can jump. You can still have a life, but when they're engaged and have an amazing day and they want to bank why it was amazing and they call you and unpack what's happening, or the converse, something happened and they actually need to come down from it, that means they're really thinking of you as their team. And you're locked together in this intensive learning experience for 6 months where it's top of mind.
Mm.
It's not just something like, oh, every 2 weeks, did I do, and now I'm talking and I'm feeling behind. They're genuinely thinking it. So, like, that also, I think, is an important financial component of it. Like, when they feel like they're paying for this, you want to use it. Humans and psychology and money are so weird, but there's a lot packed in there.
Yeah. And what I hear is very spontaneous calls that you need to be available because that's what they pay you for. It's not that they book 2 weeks in advance. I will have my next hour with Marie.
We do that too, but yes, it's both and.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's how I've chosen to set up my practice. And so you can totally do it a different way, but it does mean that you need to actually charge enough that you can have the correct number of clients that you are available.
Mhm. And how many of these sort of top dollar engagements and maybe some pro bono engagements do you have in parallel? Just so that we can imagine how your week looks like.
Again, it varies by season. It's interesting now, like January, you will get a lot of people calling. And the beginning of an engagement is quite intensive. You're getting to know the person. I do longer sessions at the beginning. Maybe we're kicking off an assessment, all this kind of stuff. You
Mhm.
could have 6 clients and have it be an incredibly intensive load, or you could have 10 and have it be less of a load, or just depending on what's actually going on.
6 to 10 one-on-one engagements, and then there's also the one-to group and the one-to-many buckets, basically.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, we spoke about your different buckets, and one of them is the one-to-group bucket, you called it. I had asked, that's not training, but that's group coaching. How does that actually look like?
Yeah. Group coaching, the idea is that you have a sort of centralizing idea or kind of topic that draws people in, something they want to work on vis-a-vis that. And then you create a group encounter where the people who are coming to it have an individual goal around that topic. For example, I do a group coaching module on the inner critic. This is something that probably everybody could use. And so that's our centralizing idea. I've created the backbone of material around that. The point is not to be a lecture series or teaching. And it is still valuable to have some learning of that type so that people are speaking the same language and can deepen their overall knowledge in service of their goal. That backbone of pre-work or exercises, I've created those on the back end. And then the group coaching encounter itself involves typically 6 90-minute sessions. There's then interstitial possibilities for lightning round coaching with me. But you have to set norms. You have to create a container. You have to do that pretty fast if you only have 6 sessions with a group of people that probably have never met before. So the first session is really a lot about that. What do we actually want to do? And then the intervening sessions, we co-create what topics we're going to do as part of that backbone. I find that really important, even though I have a lot of ideas about what's probably relevant. I don't publish an agenda ahead of time because in a group coaching engagement, I want it to mean something to the people who are there. What's top of mind for them? Well, that's what we spend a lot of time in that first session doing. For inner critic, maybe one of the subtopics is imposter syndrome, or maybe it's finding my voice. But I don't know that about this group until we figure that out together. From that first session comes the rest of the agenda of our time together. I'm very quickly able to, with all the material that I've prepared, Lego that into place.
Mm.
And so then we carry on. Typically, that's every other week. There's enough time for people to do experiments and things like that. By the end, this is now a group of people who these folks have been vulnerable with. There's often lasting relationships that come out of that. Learn things not only by working on their own goals, but by seeing other people work through their goals. And there's just beautiful moments of peer coaching. We actually talk about the idea of coaching behaviors as opposed to advice behaviors. And in a meta way, everyone is also learning and practicing this idea of being themselves a coach and being coached by others.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the one-to-group coaching model, that basically for now is an offer in your shelf, and just like Disk or other tools, you basically can pull that out when you talk to an organizational client, and you can say, look, if you have actually several people, we could run this program.
So, yes, the constant business that I have done since the get-go is the one-on-one coaching.
Mhm.
Like now I'm really genuinely thinking about these different lines of business as part of my portfolio to create the holistic outcome that I want to have. So again, it's just like this beating this drum of business person. You make it show up by, again, putting the building blocks in place and then running towards it.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Let's look at a few more offers and tools that you have in that shelf. And from what I heard, things like Enneagram, Disc, Leadership Circle Assessment. which of these is your most important, most often used tool these days?
I think that it's hard to say which is the most because I deliberately brought them into my toolkit so that I could have access to different kinds of engagements. For example, the Leadership Circle Profile 360 assessment, I find it to be a particularly interesting and expansive one. I like the way that it intakes data. I like the way that it showcases the data. I find that it really opens up a lot of coaching conversations as opposed to here's your evaluation, which is not particularly useful. That was necessary for me to work in a corporate environment of coaching a number of people. That was a requirement of what the corporation wanted. There was a 360 component. So I needed to have a tool to do that. I picked the best one that I thought was most aligned with my coaching philosophy because it's not interesting to me to check a checkbox, right? So I do use that quite a lot where that feels appropriate.
Mhm.
It's always something that's on offer for my individual coaching clients, regardless of what their company thinks. For some people, if they're brand new to a role, they're not ready to do that yet because there's not enough data from their colleagues that would feel supportive. So that's one sector. I do use it a lot. And then within a coaching conversation, it becomes clear that it is a bit of a blind spot about what your direct reports think and your manager thinks. And we could suggest a way that we could get some data about this would be this. Right.
Yeah. You also said earlier, choose one tool, stick to it, and you chose the leadership circle assessment so that you can have that one key if the log shows up of I need to unlock the 360 assessment thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Which are others?
So I find that for working with teams, the DISC is one of the most useful. I don't believe that assessments are ever right with a capital R. They're useful because they engender self introspection and conversations around things. I find that for teams in particular, the DISC is a relatively simple framework. It really focuses on communication. What are my tendencies vis-a-vis communication? How do I input information into myself? How do I output information to others? It's very illuminating in terms of team dynamic and how people can flex their own style to be more effective communicators and team members. So it's a very inspiring message as opposed to the idea of here's a laundry list of things that are wrong with you. That one I find particularly helpful if I'm going to be doing something that maybe is more in the let's use this as an entrance into a larger group of people. And then some of them may be plucked out to do coaching.
Mhm.
But now they have a similar vocabulary with one another about how we want to work as a team.
Yeah. And
Uh,
so DISC is the one of the simplest personality types model, the one with the colors, right? Or how would you describe it in 2 sentences?
yeah. So I think it talks about behavioral preferences around communication. There's the circle and 4 wedges of pie,
Mhm.
right? There's the D, the I, the S, the C. These are behavioral styles. All of them are valid and useful. There are no bad styles. That it is merely a way to understand what is your natural inclination towards giving information? For example, if you are the D style, that indicates a sense of dominance, of being fast paced, of being outspoken, and kind of, but still connected with people. If you're the I style, it means that you're more accepting and warm. And so you're less likely to talk in bullet points. If you're the S style, you are a little bit more reserved, a little more steady. You like information ahead of time. If you're the C style, you are very data driven. That's what's going to sway you as opposed to the big story. In this circle, you draw a picture and show where everybody on the team's dots are instantly. People get a sense of, oh, that's why it's so hard for us to make decisions, get things done, right? Or work with clients because maybe if like the entire team is S's, but all of the clients you're working with are D's. It provides this very visceral and instant sense, both of the diversity of styles, and people start to get curious about God, things would go a lot better if I didn't like spring a report on an S and ask them to interact with it right now. If I
Mhm.
sent that to that person an hour before, that meeting goes 150 times better. This is very simple, but it's very practical right away. And that's what I think is also useful for teams is they instantly feel like they get some unlocks and there's very concrete things that you can try and modify that pretty much always have instant results.
Yeah. So for you, it's really a team tool. And then you also don't have the dark side of personality models, which is this, okay, I did this test. Now I know I am this, and this is why I am justified to behave in this or that way. Or
Any of these tools can be weaponized,
yeah.
right? Where you say, I'm a D. Sorry, I'm just direct. No, it's self-knowledge and you know about these things. You both know that you can flex and also know what you can ask for. It's an entree into coaching. When I run disc assessments, I'll have individual meetings with people, and that's a coaching session. What is the shadow side? Strength overused becomes a liability. It's an entrance point into curious questions about yourself.
And within a team, it helps us to understand the needs and preferences of other people better. It's a tool for empathizing and also a tool that gives us as a team a common language to talk about these things.
Precisely.
In order to do that, you needed this culture of vulnerability, psychological safety, where they could come to you with a problem and talk openly about it. How did you build this culture?
In partnership with other leaders. Culture is not made alone. The etymology of the word culture comes from the Latin root cultus, which is to cultivate, to tend. The gardening metaphor is important because culture is not something you just create and you're like, cool, okay, that'll be fine forever. And now I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go do business now. Your garden's going to get overgrown real fast. I also like the culture metaphor in the sense that there are lots of different kinds of gardens. That's a good clue for you about what kind of company and what kind of culture you should go work for. And so, again, this idea that it's a co-created project. There should be a fair number of gardeners. Maybe there's one master gardener plan, but legitimately there's lots of people out there and things happen surprisingly, just like in a garden. If you go out to your garden and there's a flower you didn't plant, maybe it blew in, what do you do about it? That's actually culture too. Do you pluck it out? Is it a weed? Or do you say, oh, how cool? Let's get more of that. Let's propagate it. Or let's put a little stone there that says, this is a cool flower. There's this kind of element of both organic growth and intentional growth, this sense of collective gardening, subjective preference, and the constant culture built in these small micro interactions, right? You can't just go see your garden once a quarter. You can do it once a quarter, like a real big mulch, and that's fine. But if you haven't paid attention all the way along, it's going to surprise you in bad ways. Creating culture in the companies I've been at involves these micro interactions of if I can have a vulnerable conversation, if I can demonstrate taking feedback, especially when clumsily given as a leader, God, that really changes the tenor of the conversation for other people. If I can say, whoa, I really messed up and I made this mistake, and instead people are like, oh, wow, that mistake sucks. But let's figure out now collectively how we can have safeguards for it not happening. All of those things are contributing to this culture of what happens when something goes wrong here? What happens when something goes right? But what happens when we're not sure if it's good or bad? What do we do about it? Trust is built in teaspoons is another metaphor I think about a lot. Like lots of tiny interactions add up to how people are going to make decisions and how they're going to behave.
Yeah, and what I hear is this: we cannot declare culture. We cannot say, let's have this culture, but we actually have to live it. And it's the leaders, the gardeners, who shape it by being role models. So it is by me talking about my failures, being vulnerable. And in that way, I also shape this culture of vulnerability.
Totally. What you do speaks so loudly, I cannot hear what you say. I
Yeah.
think that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. That's really true.
Yeah. Is there any topic that you feel we haven't touched as much as we shouldn't?
I think that in some ways, being a good coach to many different people at like different ages of life and experience really helps to have had some life and experience yourself. Not because you're going to give them advice, but because you've walked that path. This goes back to self improvement and self knowledge. You're going to hit a wall with being able to help coach people to their next transformative level if you haven't gotten there yourself.
Hmm.
And so, in addition to making coaching fun for the rest of your life, it expands your capacity to be a coach for many different kinds of people when you are pursuing that level of integration on your own, continuing to work yourself with a master coach. Like, don't stop, right? Just when you're done with your program.
And maybe there's seasons for it and it comes and goes, but that's part of your toolkit as
Hmm.
well. You'll learn so much from working with people who've been doing this for a long time.
What were some of these most transformative experiences for you?
Professionally, being in situations where I didn't know what I was doing. I was in a position and I have to figure it out. That's important to me because it's not like it's always been comfortable. You have to have experienced the discomfort of flying by the seat of your pants and not knowing what's happening. And then you survived it, right? You got fired. The world didn't end. For me, being in those positions where I was thrust into a position of authority just very early on, I was hired as the web editor and I was a lowly peon. And then I was suddenly in charge of the print magazines. I had no business. I know that feeling. So again, I can relate to that as it's happening and not get caught up in the idea that the world is going to end. Actually, I have some lived experience that it won't. I think then also experiences of trauma. Again, we aren't therapists. I think there's a very important distinction between qualified to work with trauma and not. Again, having lived experiences. So for me, in 2023, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a total surprise. It was caught early, but it was completely out of the blue. And this was in the midst, I was really building my coaching practice. At a young age, I was now traversing this health question. For me, the cancer diagnosis is an opportunity to say, what am I doing with my life? Do I feel purposeful? Should I get out of the rat race? Am I spending the time I want on this limited time on earth? I really strongly felt that the profession and the things I were doing totally passed the cancer test. I was very convinced that what I was doing was impactful, did feel purposeful, did feel fun, allow me to be with the people that I wanted to be and choose who I wanted to spend time with. So again, it's not like I would wish getting cancer on anybody, but now that's part of the fabric of my experience and of getting older, right? Being a parent, having aging parents. These are all life experiences too. I didn't read about this stuff in a book. Life has a lot of curveballs in it. And just the gravitas of having had life experience, having reinvented my career several times. There were moments of deep despair throughout that. Everyone's gonna find out I'm a total fraud when I took over the people leader space from being people or being a content executive. My family's gonna starve on the street. Like totally nuts about catastrophic thinking multiple times through that washing machine of reinvention. That has a big effect on how I'm able to center myself and be in dialogue with people in different points in their life.
Yeah, thank you. This was powerful. Yeah, and with these closing words on the meaning of developing people, my conversation with Marie comes to an end. If you say, wow, this journey of finding business clients is also what I'm currently trying, I can also recommend our second episode with Helene Feuiler, who shares a rather European perspective on a very similar problem space I found. At least I could see many parallels between the two of them. And in order to connect with Marie, you can simply go to marie.coach or, of course, find her on LinkedIn. And if you want to follow Marie's recommendation of connecting with a community of peers, of other coaches and facilitators, you can join the MetaFox coach community on metafox.eu/community. Currently, this is a simple WhatsApp group, but it might evolve later in the course of this year. And already next week, we will probably get out the next episode of The Making of a Coach. If you enjoyed this one, share it with a friend and follow us wherever you listen or watch. I'm Toby from MetaFox. All the best on your journey. Bye-bye. Welcome to The Making of a Coach, where we unpack how coaches and facilitators turned their passion into profession. I'm Toby from MetaFox, and on this episode, I meet Marie Szuts. Marie's based in Silicon Valley and helped to grow the web design tool Figma as an HR leader, next to many other HR leading roles she has held. Coming from this glamorous tech world also shows in Marie's business building story as a coach, as well as in her pricing level, which I found very impressive. And yet, she grew into coaching only step by step as a... Welcome to the Making of a Coach, where we unpack how coaches and facilitators turned their passion into profession. I'm Toby from Metafox, and on this episode, I meet Marie Szuts. Marie's based in Silicon Valley and has helped to grow the web design tool Figma as an HR leader. Coming from the startup culture and the glamorous tech world also showed in Marie's business building story. On the one hand, she's operating on an, as I found, impressive business level. On the other hand, she grew into her coaching iteratively in a series of experiments. In the many days before, she built her network actually by worrying about the business of the startups she was working with. So let's start hearing from Marie herself how being an HR leader in Silicon Valley looks like. Welcome to the Making of a Coach, where we unpack how coaches and facilitators turned their passion into profession. I'm Toby from Metafox, and on this episode I meet Marie Szuts. Marie's based in Silicon Valley and has helped to grow the web design tool Figma as an HR leader. Coming from this glamorous tech world, of course, also showed in Marie's business building story and pricing level, which I found very impressive. And yet she grew into coaching only step by step as a series of experiments, as she phrased it. And building on the many years she built spanning her network. In those years, Marie mainly worried about the business building of her